Kuzu Zampo, Achule, Asewaro, Namaskar, good morning. I am happy to be here today and happy to visit Sikkim University. I thank my friend Summer, and I'm very happy to be here again and see my good friend Thanku Bahadur Suba. And the topic of my talk is endangered language communities and their history of migration to the Sikkim and Darjeeling Himalayas. When did the people who are here come here? I did not choose the title of my talk. The title of the talk was assigned to me, I think, because of the new Center for Endangered Languages, which is being founded here. So the title of the talk has to do with that. But to answer this question, it has many dimensions. So we will start in Sikkim, but we will travel to many other parts of the world to answer this question. Where do we come from, and how did we get here? First, we will start with the endangered languages. The endangered languages of the Sikkim and Darjeeling Himalayas, as you know, are Denjoke, also Hloke, also known as Loke, Lepcha, known as Rongring, Limbu, known as Yaktung. These are languages of the Sikkim and Darjeeling Himalayas that have been spoken here from time immemorial. But we want to know, how did they become endangered? So this is the first part of the story, and I will tell it very briefly. Some of it is a refresher, because some of these things you know from secondary school and from your readings in Nepali history and Indian history and Sikkimese history, so you know these things. But this is just a brief refresher. At the beginning of the 17th century, the lands as far east as the Arun were under Sikkimese suzerainty, yet the 10 Limbu kingdoms were effectively independent. Now, this photograph was taken by somebody who was outside of the atmosphere, just above Sikkim. So let me show you how to read this photograph, and I hope that this will come with me because I need to point. This is the Kali Gandaki, which enters from Tibet into Nepal, slices the Himalayas, which is a 3,600 kilometer long chain, precisely in half. It slices through the Himalayas and enters, here is Pokhara, and enters into the Ganga. Here is Pokhara. Here is a little kingdom that once existed called Gorkha. We move here. This is the Kathmandu Valley. This is the Kathmandu Valley. North of Kathmandu is Nuwakot. Here is the Kathmandu Valley. We move further east, and this is the Kosi. And from the north, the Arun River enters into Nepal, what is now Nepal, and goes through, and then many rivers join, and this becomes the Kosi. So this is the Arun. This is Sikkim. Here, of course, is Bhutan. So this is to orient you. This eastern part from Kathmandu east, after it was conquered, not by Prithvi Narayan Shah, but by his successors, the eastern part of Nepal was divided into three portions: Valokirant, Majkirant, and Palokirant, which is hither Kirant, middle Kirant, and further Kirant. For what do governments do? For tax purposes. They tax you. So these are the different parts of, those were the three parts of eastern Nepal, and that is how we should read this map. Now, the important thing, you see where the Kosi goes and where the Arun enters. All of these lands until the Arun were, until the 17th century, under Sikkimese suzerainty. The 10 Limbu kingdoms, however, were effectively independent. Now, from that Gorkha in central Nepal, the little kingdom of Gorkha attacked Nuwakot, which is north of the Kathmandu Valley, which you see as the grey smirch. And in the Kathmandu Valley, Prithvi Narayan Shah later attacked Kritipur, conquered the kingdom of Kritipur. He later conquered the kingdom of Lalitpur, which is known as Patan, Kantipur, which is known as Kathmandu, and then Bhaktapur, which is known as Batgaon. Later he conquered also Makwanpur, and started, he completed his subjugation of the Chaubise and Baise Raja in central Nepal. So it happened during his lifetime, and we always say, and we learn in school, Prithvi Narayan Shahले Nepal Ekikaran Gareko. Bhane kura, we learn this in school. But actually, it is not only he, but his successors, because when he died, Nepal was not yet what it is today. In 1776, now see that line, the Kosi and the Arun in the north. On that line, if you draw that line, you have the place called Chainpur, which is on the Arun, in the Arun River Valley. That is where the Battle of Chainpur took place in 1776. This is the same year that the British colonists, who were disloyal to their motherland in North America, declared independence and said, we want to become, the United States of America later. This is the same year that the Battle of Chainpur took place. This is when the 5th Sikkim Maharaja, Phuntsho Namgyel II, and his troops met with the troops of Pratap Singh Shah. Who was Pratap Singh Shah? We all know from our secondary school. He was the eldest son of Prithvi Narayan Shah, who had died. And he only was king of Nepal for 2.5 years, because then he also died in battle. He fought for those 2.5 years. After that, of course, Nepal was governed not by the kings, because his son was too young, and after that the next son was too young, and these people were dying too young. Nepal was governed by kakas and mamas of the Shahs, so these were the regents that were governing. That's Nepali history. But the important thing is that this was a very tragic time for the Limbus, because the Limbus lived to the east of the Arun. On the Arun itself, you have the Lohorung and the Yaka, and on the western side, the Mewahang. But the Limbus were already co-opted, and many Limbus fought on the Gorkhali side. But they fought against the Sikkimese troops of the 5th Sikkim Maharaja, Phuntsho Namgyel II, which were comprised of many Limbu troops. So Limbus were fighting against Limbus in this very sad battle. Very sad for the Limbus, because they were fighting against each other on two sides. Further Kirant, which is Pallo Kirant, which is the eastern part of Nepal, past the Arun, was only annexed after Sikkimese forces were driven out of Limbuan in 1786. So this is only 10 years after the Battle of Chainpur. Because when Pratap Singh Shah became king, all of these areas of Majkirant and Vallokirant, near to Kathmandu, had already been in uprising against his father. And the areas in the Tarai, which were called Vijaypur and Chaudandi in those days, had already been taken by a local ruler who was a Rai called Buddhakarna Rai. So when his father died, actually the whole hold on eastern Nepal had been lost to the Gorkhalis. And eastern Nepal was only conquered slowly, and after the Battle of Chainpur, it was only 10 years later that the Sikkimese forces were driven from eastern Nepal, which east of the Arun was under Sikkim. So 1786. What happened in the year after 1786? We all know, but first I remind you, Kalimpong, which is Kalimpong in Lepcha and Kalimpong in Denjoke, it came under Bhutanese control from 1707. This is an old map from 1838, but this is just to remind you, Kalimpong was under Bhutanese control. You can go there now to Kalimpong, then you drive east and you go to Bismile, get out of your car, go up into the jungle, or you ask someone who is local, or you go into the jungle yourself and you can find the ruins of the Bhutanese Dzong, Damsang Dzong. No one is protecting it, no one is preserving it, but that is the Bhutanese Dzong. Kalimpong was under Ha, under the district of Ha, the Dzongkhak of Ha. The year after they had driven the Sikkimese forces from eastern Nepal, the Gorkhalis attacked Sikkim in 1787, and we all know that this story about the Gorkhalis attacking Sikkim. This war lasted until 1792. 1 year after they attacked Sikkim, under Bahadur Shah, who was the Kaka, but he was the regent, he was not the king, but he was effectively ruling Nepal. Under Bahadur Shah, the Gorkhalis also attacked Tibet. And they went all the way into Tibet and southern Tibet, and they sacked Tashilhunpo and Lumpo, and the Gorkhalis were in Tibet and in Sikkim. And then the Tibetan forces asked help of the Chinese, and the Chinese also came, and they drove the Nepalis in 1792 all the way down into the Kathmandu Valley, and they actually defeated the Nepalis, passing down to Betravati and Tadi, which is only 15 kilometers north of Kathmandu. That's how far the Chinese forces came, 15 kilometers north of Gandhagar. That's how close the Chinese were to taking Kathmandu before they were turned back. So after that, Nepal was still there, but the hold on eastern Nepal was very tenuous, and they had to fight for a long time to strengthen themselves, and they did. And in 1814, as we know, they attacked Sikkim again, came to Tumlong, drove away the royal family for a while, and the Anglo-Nepalese War started at the same time when the Gorkhalis started expanding again. This lasted for 2 years. Nepal is considered to be the victor of the war. So Nepal won against the English, but it did result in 2 treaties which said these are the borders of Nepal and no more, because the British said you may not encroach on British lands, and they considered these lands British. And actually this area is interesting because you see Darjeeling Himalaya. The British forced their way in, and this story is a long story that you all know. They forced their way into Darjeeling, which is actually part of Sikkim historically, and they planted the first experimental tea garden at Libong, which is a Lepcha place name, in 1847. But the first commercial tea was planted from 1852 at 3 tea gardens in Darjeeling for the first time. And this is when the British deliberately, you can read it, you can see the photographs in the Tibetology Institute of Charles Bell. He was political officer, later Claude White. And you can read it in Herbert Hope Risley's Gazetteer of Sikkim. You can read it was the British policy to move Nepalis into this area. When the Gorkhalis troops entered this area, and the British forces are quite clear, and the Sikkimese sources are also quite clear, there were no Nepalis living in this area. There were Lepchas, and there were some Denjopas living in this area, meaning in Darjeeling. Gorkhali troops entered, but they were driven back. But there were no settlements. The British encouraged settlements. From the 1850s and 1860s, the British brought Nepalis in for timber, cutting timber and logging, and then building the tea gardens and then manning the tea gardens. The 1850s and 1860s is the same time that people that you know nowadays, there's this group of people, they are called Americans. They are not to be confused with the Native Americans, the people who were originally to America. But the Americans, they started inhabiting this place called California, also in the 1850s and 1860s. Before that, there were no Americans there. There were only Native Americans there. So it is the same time frame again. So people move. We cannot undo these migrations of history, and we don't want to undo these migrations of history, but these are facts of history. So it was British policy to move Nepali labor in, and then of course there was the Treaty of Sinchula. This is wars of the East India Company against Bhutan, and the Treaty of Sinchula made Kalimpong part of British India, and the 18 Duars were annexed to British Bhutan. So this is the history. This is an interesting 1876 map which shows something about Sikkim. It already shows that it shows if you look north of where Sikkim is today, you see that all of the Kampa County, which now is under Shigatse, all of Kampa County was part of Sikkim, considered to be under Sikkimese territory. Even Lake Modamling, Tso Modamling, was part of Sikkimese territory, including all of what is now Sikkim. Eastern Nepal had been, by 1876, consolidated, and Limbuan had been fully integrated into the kingdom of Nepal. And of course, Bhutan is there, and the Chumbi Valley is there. Darjeeling and Kalimpong had become East India Company territory. After the Gorkhali and the British aggression, and after these lands in the Kampa county in Shigatse were lost, this was the situation according to the American Geographical Institute in a map of that year. This is the situation in 1969 of the rump state, what is left of Sikkim, but Sikkim was once far larger. But this is what was left of Sikkim in 1869. So, recapitulating, the Gorkhali conquest of what today is eastern Nepal ultimately rendered the Limbus a minority in Limbuan. But this process only began in the 18th century, and the Gorkhali government still had to quell armed uprisings by the Limbus in Limbuan in eastern Nepal against the Gorkhali government until 1808, which means that only in the 19th century was eastern Nepal really pacified and consolidated into the Kingdom of Nepal. The British East India Company, this is their flag. They also used it in all the colonies, you can see, because some countries derive their flag from the British company flag. The red and white is, of course, English livery colors, those stripes. So the British East India Company set up tea gardens from 1852 commercially, setting into motion deliberately demographic changes that ultimately rendered the Denjobs and the Lepchas minorities in their own native lands, a process that only first began in the 19th century. So this is what happened, and this is history. That is just in a nutshell the history that led to the current language endangerment situation. But now we don't try to change history, we live with history, and we all live together in peace and harmony. Now we have Denjoke, Lepcha, Limbu, and of course many Nepalis. And we talk about this recent migration that led to the present language endangerment situation, just recapitulating history. And we talk about all these migrations, but migrations are not, they're going on now, they're going on in Europe, they're going on all over the world, they're not stopping, and they've always taken place. There are pauses where the people don't migrate, but we have always been migrating. So, to address the question that I was asked to answer, the linguistic ancestors of the native language communities of the Darjeeling and Sikkim Himalayas, where do they come from in prehistory? The language family that we must think of is the Tibeto-Burman or the Trans-Himalayan language family. It is a very important language family. After Indo-European, which is first, this is the most populous language family on our planet, the most number of speakers. So it is a very important language family. This is the fallen leaves diagram of all of the major linguistic subgroups of this language family. So we see all of the major linguistic subgroups. These linguistic subgroups are recognized by sound laws, shared innovations, so we can identify these groups. You look, the three groups of the three, Lepcha is a group unto itself, a subgroup unto itself within this language family, which contains more than 300 different languages. If we look, Bodish, also in red, includes the Tibetan dialects, the languages of Baltistan, the languages of Amdo, Tibet, but also Dzongkha, Lakha in Bhutan, the Brokpa language in Bhutan, also here, of course, Denjoke, belongs to this group, Bodish. Kiranti is a large group of many languages, and Limbu is a member of this group, along with other languages like Chamling, Kaling, Kulung, Tulung, Bantawa, Puma, so many, Nachering. There's over 20 different languages, Hayu, Jero, Chaurasia. All of these languages are part of this very diverse subgroup within the Tibeto-Burman or Trans-Himalayan language family. If we look in the upper right-hand corner, we see Sinitic. That is just one group of many groups on same level with Lepcha. But it includes Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, Shanghainese, and therefore not millions, but more than 1 billion speakers. This is why this is a very large language family, but it's only one group. And in terms of the historical linguistic significance for understanding prehistory, Chinese is no more and no less important than Lepcha. Lepcha is a group by itself, and in Sikkim we have 3 major subgroupings of this major language family as indigenous and also endangered languages. When was this language family discovered? In 1823 by Julius von Klaproth, who was a German scholar, but he was in Paris. He founded the Société Asiatique, and his language family was called Tibeto-Burman, also in the British Isles. He defined it as Tibeto-Burman, Tibetan, Chinese, Burmese, and all of the languages that are related to these three, because he didn't know all languages. But what is very important in the context of 1823 is that he excluded languages like Thai, Japanese, the Mon language spoken in Thailand, not the Mon language spoken in Arunachal, different languages, different language families. He excluded many languages that we know are not members of this language family, and he did it for the first time. So he was not just guessing, he was being very precise. And people did not know all of the languages at that time, and still we are trying to document all the languages of this language family. But as more descriptions became available, the contour of this language family became established. In the history of science, there are always people who are, at any slice of time, more knowledgeable and people who are less knowledgeable. Klaproth and his followers followed the Tibeto-Burman family, but there were also proponents for a certain time who believed another language family tree model, which was called Indo-Chinese or Sino-Tibetan. But to this very day, no historical comparative linguistic evidence has ever been adduced for this particular phylogenetic model. So Tibeto-Burman is the old model, but it is also the one that is supported to this very day by the evidence, and it's now called Trans-Himalayan. The Chinese had to go through a very long process of accepting this, because they had mistakenly accepted the Sino-Tibetan model, and now they have finally come back to the original model, because they after the Cultural Revolution, they had killed or put in jail all of the professors, so they didn't know anything anymore. And then they got some. They found out about the Sino-Tibetan theory, and then they were confused. But now they have finally also adopted this name. And to tell this history of how this happened, I am going to go to Peking, I think in 4 weeks or something, to explain this to the Chinese, but they have finally accepted and also given the Chinese name. But it has taken a long time for China to come around. This is the geographical extent of this largest language family after Indo-European. So you can see where it is spread. It has spread all the way to the east. And now I'm going to go to the map again, and maybe I'll knock everything down again, but I hope not. We know from our modern history that no Chinese lived in Manchuria until after the Second World War. So we can cut off that part if you want, because it's recent. We also know that their movement into Chinese Turkestan is recent in Xinjiang. Here, until the Dutch came in the 17th century, there were no Chinese living on Taiwan. So this part you can cut off, this part you can cut off, much of that part. And southern China here was Sinified during the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century, beginning in the 3rd century BC. So this part was also not originally Chinese. So if we cut these parts off, then and that little bit of that, then we see the original extent of the Trans-Himalayan or Tibeto-Burman language family. Something we notice immediately about this language family, of course, is that most of the speakers are located to the north and to the east of the Himalayas. Most of the speakers today. But remember, there's one small group that is no more important and no less important than Lepcha, Sinitic, which has so many speakers. But that's a recent demographic development in history. If we look at the distribution of the major subgroups, these are the linguistic subgroups that you saw in the previous diagram, then you see where they are located. Most of the Trans-Himalayan linguistic groups are still located in the original place where these people come from, where the ancestors, the linguistic ancestors of the speakers of these languages come from, and that is to the south of the Himalayan divide and also in the eastern Himalayas. So this is very interesting, because the ancestors, the Chinese, they worship their ancestors. But their linguistic ancestors and as we now know also their genetic ancestors, do not come from China, they come from here. So this is just what linguistics tells us. This is just only linguistics, the story that we know from linguistics. But what else can linguistics tell us? Because linguistics can tell us a little bit more. So this is the founder of historical linguistics. He is the first to recognize that Sanskrit was related to Germanic languages, Latin, Greek, Slavic, and he wrote this all down in 1634 in several books. And this later became propagated. At one point, even after this was all well known in the Netherlands and Germany and Sweden and France, it even became known on this island, Great Britain, and then William Jones started saying it here in many years later in Calcutta. But it is an old knowledge. But the Trans-Himalayan language family, are there any groups of languages that are related to this big language family? Well, that's a big question, because historical linguistics, he developed the methodology of historical linguistics. And historical linguistics is a 2-year course at most universities. So I cannot explain to you all of the methodology of historical linguistics now, and I will not. But there is a certain methodology, and we can only go back to a certain time depth. How far back, we don't know. Maybe 10,000 years, maybe 20,000 years, maybe less than 10,000. But we need a certain type of evidence to be able to establish relationship. We can talk about the Trans-Himalayan linguistic family with confidence. But when we go beyond that, we become less confident because the empirical basis becomes less secure. So I will introduce to you this grand theory, which was introduced over the course of time, called the East Asian Linguistic Phylum. It's at the edge of what we can do on the frontier, the pioneering frontier of what we can do as historical linguists. But the ideas are old. Kradai is a language family, and relating Kradai to Austronesian is an idea that Gustav Schlegel proposed in 1901, Vera Osterpirat very recently again. Austroasiatic, another language family, and Austronesian, another language family. Other people have proposed already a long time ago that these could be related. Conradi and Wolf proposed that Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Kradai, and Tibeto-Burman could be related. Paul Benedict Blust and Peiros said maybe Kradai, Austronesian, Austroasiatic, and Hmong-Mien could be related. And Stanley Staresta in 2001, the same year that he died of congestive heart failure in Honolulu, he proposed that all of these language families could be related. Now, the evidence for this is meager, but the linguists, so I'm not going to defend the theory, but linguists keep stumbling upon this theory again and again on the basis of what they see in possible lexical correspondences, but no firm sound laws yet. Possible, of course, morphological vestiges, and this is the evidence that Staresta adduced. East Asian shared morphological innovations, an agentive prefix, a patientive suffix, an instrumental prefix, and a perfective prefix. So this is what may be true. Now I will introduce you, because I said we are starting in Sikkim, but then we're going to go around the world a little bit. What languages might be related to the Trans-Himalayan language family that is spoken here in Sikkim? This is the East Asian language family tree. I don't want you to memorize all the names, but I want you to notice what happens to East Asian. This is Stan Staresta's tree, but because he died in 2001, his work was not published till 2005, and in 2012 I tweaked it because some of the names had changed of groups. And it's just the Benares recension, but the ideas are all Stan Staresta's. So East Asian splits into Himalayan Yangtzean and Austroasiatic and Austro-Thai. You can remember these because we will introduce them to you. And Himalayan Yangtzean, that's important, splits into Trans-Himalayan, which we have been talking about, and Yangtzean. Austroasiatic on the right-hand side splits into Kradai, and all the rest is Austronesian, but it doesn't even say Austronesian there. But we will, this is because I'm using Staresta's names. Now I will introduce them to you. This is the Hmong-Mien family. This is like a National Geographic excursion. or a Discovery Channel excursion, because we will look at the extent of this Hmong-Mien family. Starosta called it Yangtzean because of the Yangtze River, because these people have always lived along the southern bank of the Yangtze River in southern China. You see that it branches. Martha Radcliffe at Wayne University has made many Chinese scholars worked before her, and I'm not going to name all of their names, and they made substantive contributions, and then she made the most recent. So this is the most recent language family tree, but she's not the only one to have worked on it. You have Hmong-Mien splitting into two branches, and if you look, it is a very interesting language family. It splits into two branches, but it doesn't look like a really big language family, and its internal diversity is very little. So it looks like just two branches that are left of a language family that might once have been larger. And this language family that may have once existed is called Yangtzean because of the Yangtze River by Starosta. It's Starosta's name. If you read the Chinese, if you happen to read the Chinese, it says Miao Yao because they call it. They don't call it Hmong-Mien, they call the language family Miao Yao. So, but this is a language family, and this is where it's spoken. This is a map of China and Burma and Thailand, and these are some speakers of the language. What is interesting is you see that the language groups are also in northern Thailand and in Laos and in parts of Vietnam. This is historically recent. It is recorded history. It is at the same time that the Nepalis were coming to Sikkim, and at the same time that the Americans were going to California. The Hmong-Mien were going into Southeast Asia. They lived only in southern China. This is recorded, well-recorded history. So that is good to keep in mind, just where the Hmong-Mien were originally located. Now another language family, Austroasiatic, another language family of that diagram. This is Gérard Diflot. He's retired, he lives in Siem Reap, and he has given the most authoritative and most recent language family tree of this very large language family. It's very large, has more than 200 languages, but not many speakers. We see the Munda languages of India. It splits into the Munda languages of India and then into Khasi Aslian, which is again splits into Mon Khmer and Khasi Pakanik. Of these groups, some of them you will recognize, such as Vietic, which is Vietnamese, and languages related to Vietnamese like Muang and Amer and Pru. And then if you go to Khmer, you see the language of the great Khmer kingdom. So there are Nicobarese, Aslian. Here is the distribution of this language family. Everywhere where these languages are spoken, the people are in the minority except in Cambodia and Vietnam. So these are small groups that are spoken, more than 200 different languages, but you can see its geographical distribution. Very interesting. A language family that people have said might be related to Trans-Himalayan, distantly, at a distant time depth that we might not be able to recover very well linguistically. But it's just a linguistic hunch. It's not more than a hypothesis with very little evidence, some, but very little. The Austronesian language family. This is an interesting story. I'll tell you a little bit more about this language family because it covers so much of the Earth's surface. Frederik de Houtman, who is pictured at the right, he spoke Malay because the Dutch were going into Indonesia and conducting their colonial activities in Indonesia, and they fought many wars in Sumatra because the Sumatranese, they fought back, and so there were many wars in Sumatra. He was captured once, and then he was 26 months in captivity, and during this period, is it falling out of? I hope it's staying there. Okay, so what happened is Frederik de Houtman, he learned to speak Malay. Then he had a cabin boy from Madagascar. Madagascar, as you know, is near Africa. It is part of Africa. And this cabin boy spoke very fluent Dutch. And he is the one who pointed out to him Madagascar, Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, is related to Malay. And that's how he knew. Now we know even more. We know that Madagascar, this language Malagasy, is related to a specific subgroup of the languages on Borneo. Now, if you look at a map of the world, that is very, very amazing. Madagascar is right next to Africa. Its closest linguistic relatives are in one part of Borneo. It's very amazing. Then Jacob Lemaire was traveling for the Dutch East India Company. You see the name of and the flag of the Dutch East India Company at the bottom. Resembles the Dutch flag. I wonder why. he traveled around the world in the service of the Dutch East India Company, and when he did, he was a French Huguenot, and then he discovered that these languages in Polynesia were related again to the languages of the Indonesian archipelago. So people already knew that there was this language family, but then something very important happened. This is southern China again. You see Hainan at the bottom left, big island, Hainan. Way on the right, you see Taiwan, Formosa, and at the bottom right, you see the northern part of the Philippines. Then, in the middle of the Chinese coastline, you see a smudge. You see a smudge, sort of yellowish smudge, halfway between Formosa and Hainan, closer to Hainan, so closer to the left. That smudge, I'll point it out on one. This is, of course, Hong Kong. This is Macau, this is Canton, and this whole agglomeration in between is the Shenzhen area that has been built up recently. This is to give you an orientation. I told you there were no Chinese living on the island of Formosa. That's true. The Dutch, now I'll go back to this map, because why is it called Formosa? The Portuguese kept sailing from Macau to Japan through here. They sailed past this island and they said it's a very beautiful island, and they called it A Ilha Formosa, which means the beautiful island. But they never landed there because the Chinese didn't land there either. They fished offshore, but they didn't land there because if you landed, the people who lived there, who are related to the people of Indonesia and the Philippines, would drive you off and shoot you. So once a Portuguese ship, once only, they actually landed on the island because of a shipwreck and a storm. They were there for only 3 weeks, and then they made a raft of the thing, and then they sailed back to Macau, and it took them months to sail back to Macau, and not all of them made it. So they sailed back to Macau. Many of them were killed on the island because if they left the beach, they were shot with bow and arrows. The people who were indigenous to the Formosan Islands were protecting their island. This is Fort Zeelandia, which, if we look at this map, it's here, this part of Taiwan, where they built Fort Zeelandia. There are many indigenous Formosan languages on the island of Taiwan that were spoken there. One of them is Siraya. It's extinct. This Siraya language was spoken around this fort. And the Dutch, they also were very careful. They did not build their fort first on the land. They built it on a sandbar that was connected to the land. And they built a whole village there, you can see. And they built it in 1624, and slowly they took over the island. But it took a while. But the name of the sandbar in the local Aboriginal language was Taiwan. It's not a Chinese name. It's a name of the Aboriginal for the sandbar only. Now they have put dirt in between, and this whole area that was on a sandbar is now inside the city of Anping, Taichung in southern China. So doesn't look like that anymore. The Dutch tried to tax the local people. They lived on subsistence and from hunting and gathering and veggiculture. What are you going to tax? They actually tried to get deer and say, you give us so many deer and things like this. How low-B can you get? Anyway, this is what they tried to do. Then they said, we cannot tax these people, so we will just try to convert them to Christianity. That's what then they started doing. They did not do it at other places at this time because they were only interested in money, which was the one true God of the Dutch East India Company. But they did it here on this island. So, whereas otherwise they were only interested in money. Then they said, we will bring over Chinese people. Just as the British said, we will bring over Nepalis to here, they brought over Chinese people, and even the first part of the project involved 10,000 Chinese people that they brought over in Chinese ships, because they said, then we will have merchants, fishermen, and we can tax them. This was the purpose, yes. So, later in 1822, Julius van Klaproet, whom you've already mentioned, he studied all of these Dutch sources on the indigenous languages of the of Formosa, and he found that they too are members of the Austronesian language family. So if we look at the Austronesian language family, look how much of the earth it Before European colonial expansion, it is the greatest migration, the greatest maritime migration. They moved all the way to Madagascar, they moved all the way to Polynesia, and they started in Taiwan. And how do we know that? This is linguistic evidence only. This is the accepted language family tree. Bob Blust is one of the, probably the doyen at the moment of Austronesian linguistics. The Austronesian language family splits into, he actually has his model splitting into 9 groups, or 11, I'm not quite sure. But all of them are Formosan languages, and then only one group is Malayo-Polynesian. So all of the groups are spoken originally on Formosa, on that island. Then you have Malayo-Polynesian, which splits into West and Central East. Central East splits into Central and East splits into South Halmahera and West Papua New Guinea, and then into Oceanic. And if we look on a map, this is how it spread. It spread from Taiwan, then into all the pinkish area, all the way to Madagascar. Then it spread into the central area, which is purplish, then into South Halmahera and West Papua New Guinea, and then all the way to Hawaii, all the way to Easter Island off the coast of Chile, although quite a distance, and then New Zealand. All of this spread before European colonial expansion across the seas. These people on much more challenging craft, much more difficult navigation, negotiated all of this part of the globe, and the Austronesian language family spread, but it started in Taiwan. Now another language family. And the last one that you have to remember. The Kradai language family. This is the Kradai language family, and this is the spread of the Kradai language family. If we look at it, all of the stuff that is this sort of orangish, rusty orangish color that moves into Thailand, which is of course Thai, this is recent. It's historically recent because we know about this spread. We know that all of Thailand, all of what we now know as Thailand, the area, Bangkok, all of this area, was the Dvaravati Hindu kingdom. It was first a Buddhist kingdom, then first a Hindu kingdom, then later Buddhist, but first Hindu. Dvaravati kingdom until the 13th century. There were no Thais there. They were speaking a language called Mon, not to be confused with the Mon spoken in this part of the Himalayas, a different type of Mon. It's also written differently. But these Mon are Austroasiatic speakers, and the Thai moved in, and the Shan into Burma is also at this time. So it's a recent migration of the Thai and the Lao. They were located very close to only in southern China around Kunming and near to the red areas. So this is where the Thai came from, and then they overtook the entire kingdom of Siam. This is known. And then the Austro-Thai superfamily. I told you the last family, but these are not new ones. These are the ones you already know. There's a theory. It started really, Julius von Klaproth, whom you already mentioned, he looked at Thai and he said, actually Thai is not related to Chinese. If you go to Bangkok for a holiday and you take the taxi from the airport into town, you will have to pay the tollway yourself, and you will hear them say, "45 baht krap," and you'll give them 45 baht, because that means 45 baht. You'll give them, but you'll think, oh, but those numbers sound Chinese. Well, the numbers are all Chinese. There are many loan words. They're Southern Chinese loans. So the Thai is full of loan words, but if you take out the loan words and you look at the core vocabulary, Thai is another language family. He is the one who pointed this out, although he never flew to Bangkok. Gustav Schlegel was a professor at Leiden University, and he said that he first launched this hypothesis that Kradai and Austronesian were related. Benedict took up the hypothesis, but he never presented evidence for it. He did give it a label, though, Austro-Thai, but because he didn't give any evidence, and the evidence he gave was no good, Vira Ostepirat, when he finally did give real historical linguistic evidence for this language family, he called it Austro-Thai and took out the H, so that he didn't want to be confused with Benedict, because people had criticized Benedict for the quality or non-validity of his evidence. So Vira has produced real historical linguistic evidence with regular correspondences and regular sound laws and regular datings. So Austronesian and Thai, two language families that we've already discussed, and we want to put together into this we, meaning Starosta, put together and many other linguists before him into one big linguistic phylum. Two of them, already there's evidence that they form a group. And this is where this group is related, because the Kradai were somewhere in southern China on the mainland, and the Austronesian moved to the Formosa in prehistory. So this is a long time ago. Now this is all linguistics. This is all on the basis of linguistic evidence alone. So the East Asian linguistic phylum, these trees are these four: Yangtzean, Austro-Thai, Austronesian, and Trans-Himalayan. As linguists, as historical linguists, we can clearly get an idea of these trees and their branches. That we can do with sound laws. But if we go deeper into the time depth, we can see maybe they are related, but we really don't know, because we can't go further back with linguistics. There's what I called the linguistic event horizon. We can't go any further back. Then we are guessing. So these three big four language groups, four language families, are related. But how are they related? We know that very few people lived in Sikkim when the British were here, because the British did population studies and saw there were very few people here. But that's not very surprising. Now in Holland you have 17 million people in a country that is as big as Bhutan. It's ridiculous. But when the Dutch were traveling all over the world, there were only 2 million people when they were doing their colonizations. In the prehistoric past, the communities of our ancestors were only groups of 300 people. Most of the earth was uninhabited. You could live in the same place and not meet each other. So I have to do something to make it wake up. Otherwise it will fall asleep. Yeah? So I hope he's awake again. I just have to give it some exercise. Now it will. I'll use loose connection. That's possible. So we had very few people in the past, and there were bottlenecks in prehistory. What are bottlenecks? Bottlenecks, if you look at the bottle, you have all different types of people, because any population, like the population of people in this room, we are all different from each other. Even if we were to be related, we would all be a little bit different. But if they took just a group of us, a small subset of us, and moved us separately, and then we reproduced, we are going to look very different again, because split off. We know that groups split off. We even know this from all of known history. Latin gave rise to Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, Romanian. Groups split off and then they form new groups. This is how it happens. We get these bottlenecks, and this is the conception of bottlenecks. You have a heterogeneous population and a small survivor, because our populations are not as homogeneous as the wine in the bottle. So Paleolithic populations were very small, so the effect of a small group splitting off is even larger. And that's how all of these language families arose over time, because language keeps changing. Up until now, we have talked only about the evidence that we know and can infer on the basis of language. Now let's look at our genes. And let's remember that languages and genes are two very different things, because we can have a black person who speaks English. We can have Chinese people who are in Calcutta who are speaking Bengali because they are living there. So genes and linguistics are totally different things. But they are correlated. Why are they correlated? Because they are probabilistically correlated, and they might be correlated. And sometimes we actually do research to see whether they are correlated. And then we do find things. Why would they be correlated? Because we get all of our biological ancestry from our biological parents, mother and father. We might be adopted, but we still get our DNA from our biological mother and father. Chances are, although it is not always the case, chances are that we are speaking the language of either our mother or father or both, but not always. But chances over time are that this will happen. So we expect that there should be correlations, but not very perfect ones. So what have we found? This is the interesting thing. When we look, we all know that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We have 46 chromosomes. If we were bonobos or chimpanzees or gorillas, which are our closest closest relatives, then we would have 24 pairs, or something happens so that we have only 23 pairs. 22 of those chromosomes are called autosomes because we get one from our mother and one from our father. The others, which are sex chromosomes, are the same. We get one from our father and one from our mother. But if we are a man, we get an X from our father and a Y from our mother. Oh, wrong way around. We get a Y from our father and an X from our mother. If we are ladies or women or girls, we get an X from both father and mother. So we know when we look at the autosomes and we look at the X chromosome, we know that they come from our ancestors, all of our many ancestors. And we don't have just 2 ancestors, not our mother and father. We have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, and it goes on and goes on and goes on, 256. And then we have lakhs of ancestors. So we have many, many ancestors. So we have very complex ancestry. But how can we then derive, a single lineage? One of the ways is to look at the Y chromosome, because the man knows he got it from his father, who got it from his father, who got it from his father, who got it from his father, because women don't have it. So it is a pure lineage in the sense of being a purely patrilineal lineage, meaning only transmitted by men. All of us have these. We have more of these than we have cells in our body, because each of the cells of our body contains many of these. They're called mitochondria. And the mitochondria maybe 1,800 million years ago, although there's a recent article that appeared this year in Nature that says it might be 1,500 million years ago. But anyway, that these free-living organisms invaded what became later eukaryotes, and of course, we know from our secondary school biology, our high school biology, that these mitochondria phosphorylize adenosine diphosphate ADP to make adenosine triphosphate and then dephosphorylize again. So they do the metabolism, they do the energy metabolism for the cell, for all of our cells. So we are full of mitochondria. We have more mitochondria than human cells. But because they used to be in more than 1,000 million years ago, they used to be free-living organisms. They have their own DNA, but they used to be bacteria, a type of bacteria, like purple bacteria. In fact, the mitochondria in our cells are very similar still to free-living purple bacteria, like the Bdello vibrio and like Paracoccus. So they're still very similar. So they contain their own DNA. And it is not in these nice strands, like the chromosomes. It is in a sort of messy circular piece of DNA. And that's called a genophore. Bacteria have their DNA organized that way. They have a little sort of messy circular thing called a genophore. And that's what the mitochondria have. So in each of our cells, the mitochondria have these genophores with their own DNA. And all of our mitochondria is from our mother. Why? Because when the sperm cell enters the egg, the sperm is going into the egg and you have the nucleus, and the nucleus contains half of the chromosomes, and the little nucleus in the sperm's head contains the other half. But all of the cytoplasm, all of the stuff outside of the nucleus, including the mitochondria, is in the mother's egg. The sperm doesn't bring any along because it's traveling light. And it brings only, its head with the half of the chromosomes. So it comes in, and all of the mitochondrial DNA is from your mother. So every man and woman has the mitochondria of his or her mother, who she got from her mother, who she got from her mother, so she got from her mother. So we can study a purely maternal ancestry and a purely maternal ancestry, but of course we have many ancestries. We also know when we left Africa, studying the genes from the molecular clock, although the molecular clock keeps getting adjusted. This one might be adjusted too much, but non-controversial is to say 1 lakh years ago, anatomically modern humans like ourselves left Africa. And we didn't leave all at once, we left in different waves. And I can tell you about a lot of the different waves, and we did talk about it in Guwahati, but we don't have time for that. But we're going to talk about one branch of one wave. This is an article that came out in 2011 about which also used DNA from the Himalayan region to date these different migrations. These are just 2 of the major migrations. So we all left Africa, and all of us left We look for correlations. We try to see, are they related to languages or not, the DNA polymorphisms, the things, the markers we find on the DNA. And the great discovery was they are. But they're related to the paternal ancestry. They're not related to the maternal ancestry. Why does that? We speak mother tongue, so does this make any sense? It does make sense. But why? This is the group. It was a group of Swiss and Italian researchers that discovered this correlation, and since then it has been corroborated by numerous studies. And this is me in central Nepal, flying around. And and then when I was flying around, I was thinking about this, and this is what I said, or what I thought. I said, the father-tongue correlation is ubiquitous, so it is everywhere on the planet, but it is not universal, because there are exceptions, which we won't discuss, but there are some small exceptions. But its predominance, its preponderance, allows us to deduce, to infer, that mothers teaching their children their father's tongue must have been a prevalent and recurrent pattern throughout linguistic history. So some of the ways that language change probably has to do with this also. It's also easy to understand why this happens. If we look at the entire genetic landscape of the world, the mitochondrial landscape is old. It means if we go to a new place, like if no one lives in India and we colonize India, we have to come with men and women. Otherwise, we're not going to populate India. So we come with men and women, so we bring also mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondrial DNA in India is mostly old mitochondrial DNA landscape. But not only in India, everywhere in the world. If we populate an uninhabited island, the same thing happens. We bring men and women, and the mitochondrial landscape is old. But afterwards, men can travel without women. And they do. And throughout history, they do this. And Thomas Kivisild, who is a famous Estonian geneticist at the University of Cambridge in England, he calls this a Y chromosome-related disease, an inherited disease. And this inherited disease only affects males in the population, and it's called warfare. We become aggressive and we wage wars, and men spread and they kill the local population, which means they usually kill the local men. And then and this is what happens all over the place, and it's in recorded history, and it repeats itself through all of recorded history. So this is why Y chromosomal phylogeography around the world is more shallow and more recent. And this is probably how language is spread, because it correlates. The Y chromosome markers, they correlate with language families, and many genetic publications have repeatedly shown this. These are the paternal lineages of all of the people on the planet. A and B are only found in Africa at the base of the tree. C all the way down to T, they're not in alphabetical order, but these are not linguists, these are geneticists, they don't know which order the alphabet is. So but from A to T, and if you look, there are two waves. DE is one wave, and then C to T is the other wave. So this two waves moving out of Africa, and they all move, and C splits into C and the rest, which is K. F and K, and then all the rest. So all of these branches. And we will be looking, because this is a very long story to tell, and actually I can tell it, but I'm not going to here, because we're only going to focus on N and O at the bottom. You see over there N and O? That's one of the paternal clades. And now we will come back to the Himalayas. The Himalayas stretch over 3,600 kilometers from the Hazarajat highlands in the west to the Liangshan Hills in the east in Sichuan, and the Kali Gandaki, which we showed you on that map, which goes through Nepal between the Dhaulagiri and the Annapurnas. It goes right through, it cuts the Himalayas precisely in half into two segments of 1,800 kilometers, and it also happens to be the deepest river valley on the planet, because it goes very deep, and it is right next to the highest mountains on the planet, Dhaulagiri, and the Annapurnas on the other side. So it is a vast extent. So what we would think about the Himalayas is that it is a great barrier. And it is. But it is not just a barrier. It is more than a barrier. And this is what we have found through population linguistics, historical linguistic studies, and population genetic studies. Because look, when we leave Africa, the first place that people go is India. They go across what is the Near East and go to India. Very few trickle into Europe, and they go in 3 waves, and that we have published, or meaning a group of more than maybe almost 80 authors or something, including, then I'm just one of them, but in Nature. But the 3 waves that go into Europe is another question, and that's later, and that's, but most people move into India, and all of the world gets populated from here. So they move into this area, and you see it is a very lush corridor. You can see it. People move in from the northwest, and they go across. And if you look, there are some groups that entered into the malarious plains and braved the jungles of the subcontinent. But many groups skirted the very welcoming habitats of the mid-hills, because the Himalayas, not the high peaks only, but the mid-hills served as a very welcoming and very healthy habitat for our ancestors, because all of our ancestors were at this time hunter-gatherers. There was no agriculture at this time. And so to live, one of the best places to live in the world, and probably still, is this part of the world. You have an ideal habitat for human beings. And so, and also in terms of disease, because we are higher up than many of the diseases on the plains. So it served as a corridor and also as a cradle of ethnogenesis. And this we see on the basis of linguistic and population genetic evidence. Now the Mongoloid myth. This is because it's very relevant. Some of us think that some of our ancestors were Mongoloids, and some of us think of ourselves as Mongoloids. Where does this idea come from? Well, a very long time ago, Carl Linnaeus, who set up the binary system, actually he didn't set it up. Bauhinius set it up in Basel 100 years before. But Carl Linnaeus propagated it, and they usually credit him with it, although it was already 100 years old. And he decided to make all species, Clusius also used the binominal system, and that was 200 years before Linnaeus. Okay, but anyway, the binominal system is when you say Homo sapiens, or Cannabis sativa, or Oriza sativa. So you make a species name out of 2 names, and so he did this for Homo sapiens, and then he said, oh, but there are all of these different types of people. And so he tried to make sense of the different types of people. And so he said, well, I will subgroup them into subgroups. And he divided them into Europeus, Afer, which is the black Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, Asiaticus, and Americanus. This is how he divided. And then Blumenbach is the one who started the old-fashioned racial theories, the ones that are now long discredited. But he started it up. But both of these people, they didn't travel very much. I mean, Linnaeus went to Holland and England, but he was mostly in Sweden. And Blumenbach stayed in Germany. So how do they know about all these people in the world? So they started making up this racial theory based on descriptions in European colonial sources, and then trying to systematize what they think, and then engravings that people made. So they are just making up what they think. So he coined these different races, and he made one the Mongolian race. He made it up in 1776, which is the same year as the Battle of Chainpur, and the same year that the disloyal British colonists in North America rebelled against their motherland. So then he made up this name, the Mongolian race. He made it up. Then this man, Christopher Meiners, who picked up this theory, he wrote 3 big books about it, and he died in 1810, but the books were published in 1813, 3 years after he died. And he described all of the races, and he made racial prototypes, and he said, let's organize Blumenbach's races. So you got different races. You got the Caucasian race, and you got the Negroid race that he made up, and the Mongolian race, because he tried to subdivide all of this diversity which he didn't understand. And they were just making it up and trying to make sense of diversity. And they didn't know, and they wrote some really strange things. He wrote, because he had read in the histories about Genghis Khan and how cruel Genghis Khan was, he said, well, the Mongolian race must be very cruel. He conveniently ignored all of the cruelties that we know about all of the other races, including the so-called Caucasian race, which is not Caucasian anyway. But, so what are races? Modern population genetic studies and molecular studies have shown that all of the races that we have always been thinking of are fictions. They don't exist. there are no races. There are superficial phenotypical traits, and some of them change very quickly. And some of them are quite meaningless. And some of the things that they thought were so important, like this epicanthic fold, which is on the inside, a little bit, pulling down, that these are very important features. They are very insignificant features. And the molecular population genetic studies have shown for decades now that there are no races. This is a big fiction. They are superficial features, and the molecular reality is that we are all one family, and we are all very closely related at a very, very, very shallow time depth. We are all members of one family, so we should all live together in harmony and happiness, because we are all each other's brothers and sisters more closely than you can imagine. So closely related. So there's only one family, and the races are fictions. But we keep thinking in terms of these fictions. If you go to America and you fill in a scholastic aptitude test, you take a scholastic aptitude test in America, where you're not supposed to, have racism. I don't think there's any racism in America, but if you are a black person, you'll get shot for no reason. But anyway, even if there's a black man in the White House. And then if you fill in a scholastic aptitude test, you have to fill in your race, and they give you a choice of something like 50, because they divide all of the Europeans into northern and southern. They do all these strange things. When you get a driver's license in America, you have to fill in whether you are Caucasian, this, that, other, and people are confused. Sometimes they don't know which box because these are old fictions that were dreamt up by these people who didn't know anything about, and still they're there. If someone shoots somebody, like in Santa Barbara, some young American student who then shoots a whole bunch of his other students because he's one of these crazy people who then, his girlfriend didn't want him or something, and then he shoots another. And then in Santa Barbara, the University of Santa Barbara police will say, young Caucasian male. So the police are supposed to look for a young Caucasian male. The Caucasus Mountains, I show you them here. You might think they are the Himalayas, but they are the Caucasus Mountains. And here you see them connecting the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And on the Caucasus Mountains you have Georgia, and you have Abkhazia, and you have Azerbaijan. And a friend of mine, who is a very famous linguist, but he also now happens to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the breakaway Republic of Abkhazia, he with a Georgian friend were together in the United States. And in 2001, after the September attacks, the policeman pulled them over, and the policeman said, "Are you folks Arabs?" And big fat, American style policeman. "Are you folks Arabs?" "No, sir, we are Caucasians," because they are from the Caucasus. And then the policeman looked at him and said, no, these two, he said, no. You're not Caucasians. I'm Caucasian, he said. And they said, "Excuse me, sir, you are not Caucasian, and as a matter of fact, you don't look like a Caucasian." The policeman was very upset, and he said, "I'm white." So the policeman thinks he is white, and he thinks that white, whatever that is Caucasian. And so these are all fictions that were made up. And the reality is a spectrum. Because it is easier for our eyes to see, our eyes separate the spectrum at certain points, and we call one part red. But actually it's a continuous spectrum, and from one step to the next is the same distance. We're all related. It is all just apparent appearances. We're all one. So even these are fictions. The same with the Mongol Jati. You see people, here's Assamese plate, and the person who is the van owner, he thinks he's a Mongol Jati. In Delhi, I always hear about the Mongol Jati, people who think they are Mongolian, because they think their ancestors come from Mongolia. But the molecular genetics tell us another story. The linguistics, you've already seen the story. The molecular genetics tell us the same story. The people on the left of this photograph are Nagas. The people on the right of this photograph are Mongolians. But the people on the right of this photograph, their ancestors come from the area of the Nagas and not the other way around. So people are looking, because of this labeling of these imaginative Europeans just sitting behind their desks in the 18th century, they are imagining, things made up by these learned people who were very learned that they didn't know anything, that they, at least they didn't know what they were talking about in this regard. The ancestors of the Mongolians also have to look to the Eastern Himalayas for their ancestry. And this is what the genes are telling us as well. So, I told you we would only look at one part of that big family tree, the family tree of all of mankind's paternal ancestry. Here, N and O, there's a mutation. The mutations are in between parentheses, mutation number 214. It splits into two groups, N and O, approximately here, somewhere in the Himalayan corridor. We don't know where. But the N star, which in genetic notation means the ancestral form of this mutation, is found mostly in northeastern India and in northern Burma. And what about N star? The story of N star is amazing, especially to population geneticists, because N star starts in northeastern India and northern Burma and moves around like this all the way into Lapland. If you happen to be a Lap, then the chances are almost 100% that you have an N haplogroup. If you are a Finn, the chances are above 90% that you have an N haplogroup. If you are Swedish, the chances that you have an N haplogroup are closer to 0. This is the difference. Because this N moved all the way around and it spread, and the geneticists, when they saw this, you see a group of geneticists in 2007, they were so amazed and they said, isn't this amazing? And the linguists and the ethnographers said, yes, that's interesting that you find molecular corroboration for what the linguists and ethnographers have been writing for centuries. But they didn't know because they don't read. But this is the thing. And the linguists have been saying, and this is Michael Fortescue. He's retired now. He's a gray-haired old professor. He's retired. He was a professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. This is the so-called Uralo-Siberian linguistic phylum, which comprises the Uralic, Yukagir, Nifr, Chukotko, Kamchatkan, and Eskimo-Aleut language families. And this is roughly, this distribution of the N haplogroup roughly reflects and correlates with the distribution of these languages. Not perfectly, but quite roughly. And if we look at how the N has moved and where the N star is in a rooted topology, where we find the N star geographically, it makes perfect sense. But we're not going to talk about N because N and O split. We're only going to talk about O. So this whole discussion today has been about the O Y chromosomal haplogroup, but we talk mostly about linguistics. So we know, what we can guess and infer on the basis of linguistics. Now let's see if the genes have anything to do with it. O split into M175. We know that O split again, or O was defined by mutation 175, and it split into three groups, O3, O2, and O1. And these are the names of the mutations. So after the last glacial maximum, sometime these split into these subclades, and they moved in this direction. And this is their distribution. You see them moving not out of Mongolia, but more out of Limbuan and the Lepcha lands and the Denjopa lands, moving from this eastern Himalaya, not just Sikkim, but this region, east. Then we also have evidence from linguistic paleontology, which is another talk altogether, but about who domesticated rice. And we know that the carriers of the O2 and were probably the domesticators of rice. And this is another talk. And there's an article that you can download from the internet, 2012b if you want. It's freely downloadable. So you can read about it if you want to read about this topic. So these spread. And then they break up again. O3 breaks up into two groups, O2 breaks into two groups, and O1 splits into two groups. And guess what the correlation is. M134 that you see is the Trans-Himalayan linguistic phylum. If you are a speaker of Han Chinese or Limbu or Lepcha, the chances are way above 90% that your paternal lineage is M134. Look at M7, the chances are way above 75% that if you are a Hmong-Mien speaker, your paternal lineage is M7. The reason is some Hmong-Mien have M95, which is O2A, because these two apparently crossed paths in the past. O2 splits into M95, and Austroasiatic speakers have their paternal lineage M95. Look at M176. They didn't leave any linguistic traces, but they spread all the way to Japan and Korea, but they don't seem to have left any linguistic traces. That happens. O1 is Thai. O1A is Formosan and spreads all the way to Madagascar, New Zealand, Easter Island, Hawaii. So this split comes, and where does it come from originally? If we look at just our trans-Himalayan linguistic family, and we move away from the population genetics a little bit, but not entirely, the center of linguistic diversity is here, where we are now. Maybe a little bit to the east, maybe a little bit to the west, maybe this whole region. But also, we know by doing things like mismatch studies, mismatch distribution, and rooted topologies, we know that in the molecular genetic studies that the diversification of the language communities in the eastern Himalayas is also of great antiquity. You can see that the differences between Tamangs and Kirantis and Gurungs and Magas is not a recent differentiation. It is old. And that we can see in the population genetics. So all of these groups have, there's antiquity of residence. These groups have been here for a long time. This is a very welcoming habitat. So there's no such thing as the Mongoloid race, but where do the ancestors, the linguistic ancestors of the speakers of trans-Himalayan languages come from? Where do the ancestors of all of the East Asian linguistic language phylum come from? Somewhere from the eastern Himalayan region is the conclusion. At least at one point in our shared past. And that is the very amazing thing. When we talk about recent history, of course, the Limbus have been living in Limbuan from time immemorial. The Lepchas have been living in this land from time immemorial. The Denjopa, sometimes we think of the dynastic history, but the dynastic history is something very different than the history of the people. The Denjopas are a southern Bodish language, which is they're quite distinct from the languages of the central Bodish, west Bodish. It's very close to Dzongkha. And if we look at Bodish as a whole unit, it is most closely related to East Bodish, which is in Bhutan, central Bhutan and East Bhutan. So again, and Sikkim, of course, was larger at one point than it is today. So the speakers of the Denjoke language, the linguistic ancestors, are also from this area. And they have been here long before the dynasty that is ruling established itself. We would not want to think that the Dutch people came to the Netherlands only when the ruling dynasty of the House of Orange came, because they came much later. This is a different story. So the people who are here have been here for a long time, and all of the people who are here are going to stay, and all of the people here are going to live in harmony with each other and continue to live happily. But this is a beautiful place to live, and it is a cradle of ethnogenesis. We are in the middle of a cradle of ethnogenesis. We are in the middle of a corridor. All of the people whose linguistic ancestors populated the North and South America, they went through the eastern Himalayas, they crossed the Brahmaputra and went east. The people who populated Lapland, their ancestors crossed through the eastern Himalayas, crossed the Brahmaputra, and then went all the way around. But this is a center. And I haven't then even told the other story of the Baun and Chaitri and where their ancestors come from, which is also in the Himalayas, but another part. But that's another story, and maybe I'll tell that some other time if you ask me back. Thank you. At the bottom of the page is a website. If you go to that website and you want any of the publications, except for the books, all of the articles are freely downloadable. You see the names of the people in my research team. I'm one of the people. You click on the name, and then you have all of the publications, and you can freely download them, just as PDF files, like that, automatically. So.
questions from the floor are welcome.
If anyone has a question, I will be happy to try to answer.
I think they've been too mesmerized to ask questions.
Oh, I hope I have not intimidated anyone by you should not be afraid of me though.
केही छ क्वेसन कसैलाई केही नबुझेको कुरो केही सोध्नुपर्ने केही जान्नुपर्ने के इच्छा लागेको कुरोहरू सोध्न सकिन्छ
नेपालीमै सोधे पनि हुन्छ नि
त्यही त
उहाँले बुझ्नुहुन्छ कि
म त बुझ्छु हो नेपालीबाट सोध्यो भने पनि हुन्छ
कसैलाई केही लागेको छ आफ्नो जाति आफ्नो भाषा संस्कृतिबारे छ भने प्रश्न गर्दा हुन्छ जसरी म गर्दैछु मलाई लाग्यो कि हामीले सिक्किममा हामीले इतिहास हेर्दाखेरि तपाईँले भन्नुभयो जेनेटिक हिस्ट्री अलगै छ तर डाइनेस्टिक हिस्ट्री अलगै छ र डाइनेस्टिक हिस्ट्रीमा हेर्दा के देख्छौँ कि भोटबाट आउँदाखेरि यहाँनिर मगर जाति सिक्किममा थियो भन्ने तर अहिले सिक्किममा मगर जातिको इतिहासै कहीँ न कहीँ हराएर ओझलमा परेको छ द हिस्ट्री अफ द मगर्स इन द किङडम अफ सिक्किम सो इज इट the story goes like that. They have also migrated from the north rather than from the corridor as they're the part of it. So what is the actual linguistic genetic evidence? Did they migrate from the north? Like Gurungs also came from the upper region of the Himalayas towards the land, or is it actually they settled here and some part went beyond the barrier?
This is a very good question.